Thanks, Janet, for that kind introduction. It's very gracious, and this has been a really impressive crowd to be among, and thank you all for being here. Huge thanks to the organizers who've done a crazy amount of work just dealing with all of those kinds of little details that I can't even handle myself. So this whole event has been really impressive, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer time because those discussions have been so interesting so far. It's actually really great for me to be here because Presbyterians were actually the first contact that I had with people who were of the conviction that there was a place for gay people in the church. My best friend's family, when I was growing up, were members of Downtown United Presbyterian Church in Rochester, New York. Any represents? And which was a more light congregation very early on. And I myself grew up Methodist, and in a very devout family. My mother eventually became a Methodist pastor after my brother and I had gone away. And I left the church because of the issues that a lot of you have with the church, just dealing with the exclusivity and the small-mindedness of people. Eventually, after years, just wore me down until the entire thing became implausible. And there's a study that was done recently that found that the preponderance of gays and lesbians leave the churches or the religion that they grew up in, whatever it is. And I think that my research has been, in a lot of ways, an attempt to reconcile a lot of the just baffling ideas that I was confronted with growing up in the church and trying to make sense of what was going on in a very confusing place where there was a lot of double talk and a lot of hypocrisy. And I appreciate very much the work that organizations like this are doing to address that. I think that's very powerful and a very important kind of work to be doing. So yeah, I am speaking to you from the position of somebody who does identify as secular, and so hopefully what I'm saying will resonate in some way. Hopefully there'll be something for everybody to take away or to engage with in some way, and hopefully we can have a really interesting and productive discussion. The church we can see from here, I don't know much about that, but I know that it's going to be shaped in part by the struggles that are happening today, and not just the outcome of those struggles, but the process. And that's what I want to talk about. It's not necessarily a bad thing when politics come into the church, in spite of what a lot of the people that I encountered in doing my research felt. A lot of people saw just politics as the opposite of the good, and whatever they maintained as good, other people were being political. They're selfish and political. They're cynical and political. I'm selfless. I'm gracious. I'm devoted to God. They're devoted to politics. They're worldly. And I don't think that's what politics is. I think politics is the means to achieving the good. And the problem is that when these struggles become intractable, it can be exhausting, it can be aggravating, people get burned out, people leave, people don't want to be around anymore. And part of the reason that those struggles become intractable is that it's hard to listen to each other. And it's very wearing because these arguments touch not just on our ideas about what should happen in the world, but our worldviews, our understandings of who we are, who God is and what God intends for us. And to have to argue about this constantly can be really tedious, to say the least. But the problem is that when we can't listen to each other, it's impossible to find a way forward. So I've observed recently that political struggle can be productive, and many of you may know this, when it has with it an element of reconciliation, or what Martin Buber called dialogue in it. And I was really pleased to hear Eddie talk about George Herbert Mead yesterday, because I've actually been working on an article that compares the views of George Herbert Mead and Martin Buber, because I think they both have very interesting views of the self, but that's for another time. So in the 1960s and 70s, racial reconciliation theologians developed ways to deal with the racial tensions in this country and in the church, and pointed out that we can't have real reconciliation without whites recognizing and repenting of power differentials, of the social structural forms that racism takes, of the politics of race in this country. Excuse me. But of course, it's been a lot easier for whites, those with the power, to focus on being friends, reconciliation at an individual level, rather than working for changes that would actually involve a sacrifice of authority, a sacrifice of material privileges and benefits that whites just get naturally, whether we want them or not. The gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual case is not exactly parallel, but we can learn a lot from racial reconciliation. For instance, never forgetting that when it comes to the church, this isn't a question of equal sides duking it out, that one side has a great deal more authority. But then the struggles for racial justice, or any justice, rarely are evenly matched. That's why it's a struggle for justice. Right? I actually learned a lot more about dialogue and reconciliation in a completely different case from the one that I'm here to talk about. I learned about it more recently in the case of Jewish-Palestinian dialogue, although it's not because Jewish-Palestinian dialogue involves Jews and Palestinians that it works so well. That's just where I happened to stumble across it working particularly well. It was this work that shed light on things that I was seeing in my earlier research on United Methodists' debates about homosexuality. So today I'll share some of my observations from my work as a sociologist that might help people to see a way through conflict and point forward. Some of it might be familiar to some of you, no doubt, and I don't doubt that many people here in this room have more experience than I have with techniques of dialogue and reconciliation. But hopefully I'll raise some questions and give people something to think about, make it worth your while to have gotten out of bed so early on a Saturday. But first, there are some things to keep in mind. Let's see. Oh, look, it's things to keep in mind. See, right there. There's some things to keep in mind before we even begin this discussion. And the first thing to keep in mind is that different people are different. Don't forget this. You might want to write it down. Different people are different. It seems pretty obvious, but when it comes to sexuality, we often forget it. We often assume that if we know one person who's a certain way, then everybody else who's, kind of like them must be the exact same way. When Alfred Kinsey did his research on human sexuality in the 1940s, he actually came up with, many of you may be familiar with this 7-point scale of just behavioral variation in people's lives, ranging, I don't know how far back you can see this, but 0 is exclusively heterosexual, 6 is exclusively homosexual, and this is just in terms of people's sexual liaison. And then 1, would be incidental homosexual behavior. 3 is equal parts hetero and homo behavior, and 5, would be incidental. The even numbers there are more than incidental, but still predominantly either heterosexual or homosexual. And he actually portrayed it this way. And so people could fit anywhere in here, just in regards to behavior. And so part of what this suggests is that someone might vary over time. If somebody has had one sexual experience in his or her life, that is going to put them either in 0 or 6. But the more experiences they have, the more possible it is for them to be somewhere in the middle. And if we judge or determine somebody's sexual orientation based on their behavior, then their sexual orientation could change as a result of just them having more experience, being around more. He was just talking about behavior, but sexuality also varies. Oh, that's kind of hard to see, I think. The pink circle says behavior, identity, and attraction or desire. Sexuality varies with regard to all of these things, and so if you're talking about homosexuality or same-sex orientation, you can have behavior and identity. You can have gay sex and I just said gay sex in the front of a big, huge church. I'll probably do it again. Gay sex. All right, so you can have gay sex in a church. And you can identify as gay, but you might not have the attraction. For instance, in the early 70s, there was this idea that it was, among, certain circles of feminists, that it was anti-feminist to be involved with a man. So even if you kind of might prefer that, you would work on conditioning yourself to appreciate being with women. You can have behavior and attraction, right? You can have gay sex, you can like it and want to do it without the identity, right? No, I'm not gay. That's just what we do in the locker room after the football game. So different people are different, okay? People can vary in terms of attraction, in terms of behavior, in terms of identity, in a lot of very complicated ways. So that's one big difference. And as I suggested, we're talking about Kinsey, some people can vary over time. Not because they think that the way they were was wrong and then they, repent. Of course, people change in that way too, sometimes, often with complete disastrous consequences. But sometimes people witness to it working for them. Whatever. But also, sometimes someone could be attracted to one person or people like that for a long time, and then their desire just shifts over the course of their life. Or someone can, if someone is in the middle there, there's been a study of bisexuals that found that that bisexuals tend to identify as either gay or straight depending on the gender of their partner at the time. And so then they could see, and it's not because of any motivation necessarily on their part. It's not because of their views, their political opinions, or anything like that changing. It's because their friends change. If a woman was in a partnership with another woman, she's going to be doing lesbian things, hanging out with lesbians. And if they break up and eventually she gets with a man, people might be like, oh, what? So what's that about? What, do you hate us now? Or whatever. They tend to just kind of fall away a lot of times from their old friends. And so their identification, who they identify with, changes. Not because of any motivation on their own part, just because of who they happen to be with. So some individuals vary over time. And if one person changed, that doesn't mean that we all can or should, right? A lot of times, I know this guy, he's with Exodus International, he wrote this testimony, he changed, therefore everybody can change. No gay person should ever have to live as gay because look at this guy, Andy, he changed. It doesn't follow. Just because something does happen, that means it should happen for everybody, or it could happen for everybody. And similarly, a lot of times gay people will say, I tried to change, and it didn't work. Therefore, no one can change. And again, it's the same kind of fallacy of saying, if it's true for one person, then it must be true for everybody, because it's hard for us to remember, when we're talking about sexuality, that different people are different. So there's that kind of variation. And just as there is a wide range of experience, of attraction, of identification, there's also a wide range of views. I always surprise my students by telling them there are not just two religious views about homosexuality, good, bad, born, choice, whatever. There are a lot of different kinds of views. And so it's important not to let our sort of stereotypical understandings of what someone must think become frozen, so that as we engage in a struggle with somebody who disagrees with us, we're just arguing with a stereotype instead of listening to them. And I'm going to talk about that a lot, but first, I just want to share with you, this is not, religious views of homosexuality. This is a little typology that I developed. It's not set in stone. I'm going to talk about 6 different kinds of religious views, just to shake things up a little bit. There might be 7, I don't know. it's possible that somebody can use aspects from different views. People can overlap, people can change their minds, people can sort of be muddled or confused, or they might have a perfectly coherent view that draws from different aspects of this. But this is just a heuristic, a tool to help us to sort out the different kinds of views that might be there, in an effort to make it especially clear why it's important to actually listen to where somebody is coming from. So I tend to draw them out in sort of a chart, just because that's easier for me to see. They could be in a line, it could be in a list, it could be in a circle, I don't care, it doesn't have to be this kind of chart. But basically we're going to have two anti-views, two middle views, two pro-views. So you know where we're going. And the first anti-view is the God hates fags view, the Fred Phelps view. If you ever see Fred Phelps and the members of his family, picketing your church or something like that, with their little, his little grandchildren holding their signs with the stick figures, going at it, whatever, no tears for queers. That's what I'm talking about, right? This very, very deeply anti-gay view that kind of maintains that homosexuality is evil, but it's not limited to Fred Phelps, alas. I've talked to people who were told, once they were caught having sex with someone of the same sex as them, or once they told their pastor that, there's just no place for you in our church, get out. We do not want your kind here. And that, this idea that homosexuals are evil people and they don't belong in the church, they're the opposite to the church. And a lot of times, people tend to assume that anybody who believes homosexuality is sinful kind of thinks that. And this view has been around a long time. Sorry, let me just get another drink of water. 1 second, excuse me. All right, so this kind of view has been around a long time, and decades ago, when people started saying, wait a minute, the church is supposed to be for everybody. It's unchristian to shut people out of the church. There started to be some movement on that area. And so, I just pushed some button. Okay, so that led to the more common love the sinner, hate the sin view that might be very familiar to you. It's not the same as God hates fags. This view draws from that critique with integrity and says, yes, it is unchristian to shut gay people out of the church, but we're firmly convinced that the Bible prohibits homosexuality in these ways, and it's a sin, but we're all sinners. But Jesus said to the woman at the well, go and sin no more. I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. And, I think Mark talked about this on Thursday, that a lot of times the analogy is that homosexuality is like alcoholism. Even if it is innate, that doesn't make it healthy or good. And getting people to explain to me how homosexuality hurts people was very difficult. I never got a very satisfying answer. But someone was like, well, it hurts themselves, because they're not supposed to be doing it, because God said no. And, if my brother were to come out as gay, that would hurt my dad, because my dad hates fags, or whatever. So it's not really it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you take it makes sense, if you think about it as some kind of illness or disease, it makes sense, right? There are dysfunctions in people's lives. There are genetic dispositions to do things that are harmful. And it's the job of not just the church, but any loving community to help people not to hurt themselves, to help people to get better. And just because it's innate doesn't make it good. We're born illiterate. We're born not potty trained. These are not good things. We have to overcome them. And similarly, some people might have to overcome homosexuality. And one man said to me, that view that people are born gay and can't help it, just takes away free will. We all have choices. We're not robots. And to say that gay people are robots, gay people have no free will and straight people do, is insulting to gay people. All right, so the ex-gay movement clearly fits in here, right? Gay people belong in the church as long as they repent of their homosexuality. And we can welcome them as friends, we can have them at our table, we can have special, training sessions to teach them how to play baseball, and they do this. And we can offer therapeutic help in the form of support groups so that they can try and overcome it. I could go on for hours about the ex-gay movement. I find it fascinating. But okay, so two kinds of views that maintain that homosexuality is sinful that are very different. In one, it's fixed in evil people, and in the other, it's not. Right? These are very different views of personhood. Middle views. Okay, so one is a little more anti-gay, one's a little more pro-gay. The first moderate view is, we don't talk about that. Why are you talking about this? We don't talk about that. Why are you still talking about it? And there's a positive thing about this, that it can give people space to live their lives. Because if no one talks about it, then as long as you don't get caught, you're fine. And if you get caught, no one will talk about it. So it gives you space to live your life, but on the other hand, there's a burden of being in the closet, right? And having people say, like, why aren't you married yet? Having people say, why are you still living with that person? There are huge burdens to it, and it can involve a lot of mental work and a lot of, drained energy and things like that, but there's still the space to live your life. And interestingly, this is actually the view found in traditional Islam. We don't tend to think that because now we tend, Europe and North America, we tend to think of ourselves as liberal and Islam is very conservative. But originally, late 19th, early 20th century originally, when Europeans started investigating the Orient, which included the Middle East for them, the problem that they had with Muslims was that they were too tolerant of homosexuality. Now that we envision ourselves as so tolerant, right, and George Bush could fashion himself as like on the side of feminism and women when it came to Afghanistan, now the problem with them is that they're too anti-gay. But it's just that they don't talk about it. And when you force them to talk about it, they'll say, well, sure, yeah, that's sinful now that you mention it, but why are you talking about this? Okay. Pardon me. All right. The second moderate view is moving toward the progressive end, right? Moving toward the accepting end. It's a view that espouses tolerance, and it says they're born that way and they can't help it. And this is probably very common in movements like this. If somebody is born that way, one of my colleagues was in my office the other day fuming about her students who were like, well, if you can't get married, why should you even have rights? Talking about same-sex marriage. And, she was like, well, I think that gay people are born that way. And I'm like, okay, fine, you can think that. And she was very, upset about her students' intolerance for that reason. But this view depends on innateness to make it okay. And so if you're going to look back at that Kinsey scale, anybody who's anything except exclusively homosexual, a Kinsey 6, should, if they can help it, right, they should do what it takes to be with someone of the other sex. That's kind of what it implies. If you can possibly help it, you should. But if you can't help it, we shouldn't be mean to you. It implies that not only can't homosexuality be chosen, but it wouldn't be chosen. Who would choose that terrible thing? Who would choose that sad life? It's not very affirming of gay life. It's not very affirming of the wonderful positive things that come out of it. And it lends itself to a view that homosexuality is a sickness, a piteous view. Those poor souls can't help it. Not that everybody who maintains, a lot of people change their mind when it comes to them that they're born that way and they can't help it. It's not that they intend to look on gay people as pitiful people, but if you're going to be engaged in a conversation with somebody, they'll be like, okay, fine, so they can't help it. You're sort of pitying them, and that forces gay men, lesbians, transgender people, bisexual people, into this sort of role of the piteous person, of the pitiful person. And similarly, the guy who said, we're not robots, we have choices, right, was saying, you're selling these people short, right? I mean, he actually told me that everybody is inherently bisexual, and it's everybody's job to fight off those same-sex urges. And I was like, really? I've met some straight people who would say they've never had any desire for people of the same sex as them. And he's like, they're lying. And I was like, okay. And the reason he knew this was because his roommate in college was a biologist who had mice in his cage, and the mice, there were 2 male mice in the cage, and they would have sex. And this doesn't tell us anything about people, but it tells us a lot about this guy who was speaking. But he maintained, right, that we have choices. I have made a conscious choice to stay on God's path and to reject my desires for other men, and it's selling people short to say that they can't possibly do that because they just can't help themselves. All right, and as I said, it implies if you have any choice at all, you should choose heterosexuality because it's great. Okay, so these are 2 middle views, right? We don't talk about sex, and they're born that way, they can't help it. One's a little more toward the anti-side, one's a little more toward the pro-side, no question, but they're kind of in the middle. Okay, I guess we could have 2 lists, sort of, too. Whatever. Pro-gay views. So the first pro-gay view is the God's good creation view, that homosexuality is that God makes some people lesbian, God makes some people transgender, God makes some people bisexual or gay, and that diversity teaches us more about God's love. That diversity teaches us about the different forms that love can take, and teaches us about the ways that love can transcend social conventions. And we have to, if we appreciate God's creation, then we have to appreciate everything that God produces. Absolutely. This view also sort of maintains, or lends itself anyway, to the of course they're born that way, of course it's not a choice kind of view. People get very uncomfortable if they're working in this kind of paradigm. They get very uncomfortable with the idea of somebody changing. Because wait, if God made you that other way, then why would you change? Something must be wrong. You must be going against God's plan somewhere in here. Okay. And so that leads to the number 6 view, the godly calling view. And as Presbyterians, I know the calling is a much more familiar concept to you than to the Methodists that I was working with before, who don't really have that concept. Although interestingly, in the evangelical congregation that I studied, they use books that by like Bill Hybels and megachurch pastors who talked about the calling. And that if you can be called to be a nurse, you don't have to be born a nurse. Right? You can be called to be a nurse and answer God's call to be a nurse. You can answer God's call to being a pastor. And in queer theology, there's the assumption that, and the understanding that you can be called to be transgender. You can be called to be lesbian or gay or bisexual. That you can choose to answer that call, to live in a way, for instance, maybe that counters or that challenges the idol of social convention, that people, see social convention as something that God mandated, rather than, they see that as, as a facet of God, rather than seeing it as something people invented to, make it easier to tax people or something. And so to choose to answer the call, to live outside of those conventions, can be a positive choice that somebody can make. There's a theologian by the name of Eugene Rogers who makes the argument that God's love isn't expressed for human beings in in reproduction, in procreation in that way. Because there's sort of a mandate to do that. People do it because they think they're supposed to. People do it because they see it as sort of an evolutionary imperative to be fruitful and multiply, or to just that species reproduce themselves. And he says that God's love is like adoption. God's love is freely chosen. It's love. It's the deepest, most powerful love, and it's chosen. And God chooses to love us as people, and that for him. Same-sex relationships, again, are chosen in spite of all the odds, in spite of the failings that human beings have, in spite of the disappointment that human beings and in our fallenness pose to God. God chooses to love us anyway. Similarly, in spite of all of the crap you can get. I said crap in church. In spite of all the crap that you can get for being gay, you choose to love anyway. And that teaches us about God's love. And in this view, homosexuality doesn't have to be innate to be righteous, which is a fine thing, because whatever anybody says, science is not really anywhere near proving that homosexuality is innate. I don't think it ever will, because sexuality is far more complicated than genes. It's possible that some people are born more disposed to like this kind of person or that kind of person. But what happens in the course of childhood development, what happens in the course of life, what options are available in a particular society versus a different society, all of that is so huge and so profoundly shaping of who a person is that isolating a gene isn't going to be the last word in any of it, particularly because it could be like alcoholism. There could be a genetic disposition to alcoholism too. It doesn't answer the argument. It doesn't challenge the view. And, finding the gay gene can just as easily lead to a whole eugenic movement to abort those fetuses or something. So it doesn't have to, if you just say it doesn't have to be innate to be righteous, who cares if it's innate or not? It's a good thing. It's a good choice. It's actually affirming to people whose lives have taken that shape. So these are our sort of 6 views. And in the course of talking with people, how do you know where somebody stands? Well, it might help to listen to them. I'm not saying it necessarily will, because some people just talk a bunch of nonsense, but it could help to listen to them. There are some very smart people that, believe it or not, disagree with us. It can happen. And remember that different people are different, not just when it comes to sexuality itself, but views of sexuality. And so don't treat people as stereotypes. We have to ask them about their views and really listen to them. And that brings me to this idea of dialogue. And I know that, there are many different forms that this takes and that you're involved with. There are techniques for this, and I'm not going to talk about what these techniques are. I'm just a sociologist. But there are a lot of people who are highly trained in really helpful, productive techniques of dialogue that might be useful at some point as you engage in these struggles. And so I actually want to start by telling a story of what dialogue is not. It's easy to point to a congregation's shortcomings. The congregation that I'm going to be talking about did a lot right, but hopefully, by seeing what not to do from a distance, right, then it can make it, with some anonymity and everything, it can make it easier to see it when it happens in our own lives. So in one of the congregations where I did my field research, some meetings were organized by people who thought the church needed to welcome lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals. I don't know if transgender was even on their radar at the time. Into every aspect of the church's ministry and life. They wanted to become a reconciling congregation, which is analogous to a more light congregation in the Presbyterian case. And these organizers tended to have a very clear view of what the problem was, what was getting in the way of this congregation becoming a reconciling congregation. And the problem was this: there were people who were either ignorant about homosexuality, or they were just afraid of homosexuality. They were afraid of gay people. And they took the word homophobia literally. So they attempted to have some reconciliation meetings, but underlying the organization of these meetings, the meeting was going to be like, 7 to 8 on a Wednesday. And underlying the organization of these meetings was the organizers' understanding that we've got to, be efficient about this and move forward. But also that after we have this conversation, then all these stupid people with their, who are being driven by fear will realize that their ideas are stupid, and they'll realize that their fears are unfounded, and then they'll change their minds or at least step aside, and then we can get on with things. That didn't really set up a dialogue, interestingly enough. And it wasn't lost on the people who disagreed with the organizers' views. And people who believed that there were very clear prohibitions in the Bible, who did not feel afraid, who were not ignorant, and who were just insulted by the whole operation. So, for instance, Mark was a lawyer in his late 30s who believed that the Bible prohibited homosexuality for reasons of social order. And in an interview after the meeting that he attended, he told me, this reconciling congregation thing, if you observe the way they're carrying it out, it's really a very targeted, sort of one-sided thing. They're pushing this thing through. It's not, well, let's go out and really find out how people feel. It's put them in a room, make them feel uncomfortable, have some minister say that if you think homosexuality is a sin, then you're probably going to go get a gun and shoot a homosexual if you meet one, and then say, how do you feel about the issue? Right. And we both laughed, right, when he said that. And he says, the guy sitting next to me, who was a minister from a neighboring reconciling congregation, his discussion was very similar. He said, if you're opposed to this, then you're a homophobe, you're sick, you're like an apartheid fan, something like that. So I think it's just hopeless that they would actually find out how people feel by doing that. I don't think they want to know how people feel. So this wasn't actually as helpful an operation as it could have been. In fact, at that meeting, Mark participated in a heated discussion. There was a point, he said something, and a lot of people started talking over him. But the main person who was taking him on was a woman named Marcia, who had a lesbian daughter. So I'll just talk a little bit more about this example that didn't work, and then I'll talk about sort of what true dialogue looks like and why it's relevant. At this meeting, Mark presented the viewpoint that the people of God must stand against homosexuality, both to promote God's will and to preserve social order. A third participant had said something about what he described as the church's homophobia, and Mark replied, is someone homophobic if they think homosexuality is contrary to God's teachings? There's a reason to think homosexuality is not okay, and it's not a phobia. It has to do with social order. Is the idea that homosexual relationships will be seen as comparable to or as good as heterosexual ones? And Marcia interrupted him, right? I mean, that might have been a place to say yes, right? But nobody said yes. Marcia said, excuse me, but do you think they have a choice? It seems like you're saying they must have a choice, right? Notice he didn't say anything about choice, but she's projecting that. Now, I can tell you, as a mother of 3 daughters, all about the same age, all with the same father, 2 of them are heterosexual, and the youngest one, well, since she was a year and a half old, I knew she was different. I didn't have a name for it back then, but she's a homosexual. And she did not choose it. In fact, she tried very hard not to be. She tried to fight it. And she was afraid to tell us. Are you saying she chose that? Because she didn't choose it. And having 2 heterosexual sisters, all about the same age, with the same father. And Mark says, okay, yeah, but if you want to make a genetic argument. And she says, well, how could she have chosen it? She fought it. Do you know gay people? And Mark said, sure. I mean, they haven't been my best friends, but yeah. And she says, but you think they chose it? So in this conversation, we see a dynamic that I saw over and over and over. When Mark began by saying that homosexuality is sinful for reasons of social order, someone could have responded by asking him more about what that threat is that homosexuality poses. Oh, tell us about this threat to social order. We could open a conversation in that way. I'm not saying I thought to do that at the time when I heard him say that either, but someone could think of that if they had adequate training maybe. But that's not what happened. Rather, Marcia argued against him from the standpoint of choice, claiming that homosexuals do not have a choice about being homosexual. As the conversation went on, Other members took on Mark's claim about social order by arguing that gay people didn't choose to be gay, that church members should love everyone, that it's insensitive to call homosexuality sinful, and that love is not harmful. Yet they did not address Mark's central argument. On its own terms, Mark maintained that homosexuality is sinful because Christians must follow certain codes that God has laid out to mark themselves as people of God and to prevent anarchy. Most of the people that I spoke with, this isn't a Methodist thing, right? Most of the people that I spoke with didn't have that definition of sin at all. They generally, regardless of whether they were in the evangelical congregation or the liberal one, they generally saw sin as separation from God, which didn't necessarily have anything to do with social order. But no one challenged Mark's understanding of what sin was. No one said, as I mentioned before, like when he asked, is the idea that homosexual relationships would be seen as comparable to or as good as heterosexual ones, no one could just say, yeah, that's what we're going for. That's the plan. They didn't appear to listen to him. They didn't register what he was saying, and so he left the meeting more convinced than ever that not only that they had abandoned God, but that they were just cynically trying to manipulate the people in the church. Somehow, pro-gay members repeatedly found themselves unable to respond to their detractors within the language of morality, saying, yes, same-sex relationships are as good as heterosexual relationships. They found themselves to even listen to what other people were saying, even in a forum specifically created for that purpose. Marcia's final gambit, as you might remember, was to ask Mark if he knew any gay people. And he responded, well, they haven't been my best friends, but sure. And a lot of times, people in this movement talk about knowing gay people because often it's the experiences that they have with lesbians or gay men or transgender people or bisexuals that make them realize that there is no value difference between heterosexuality and homosexuality, or normative genderism and transgenderism. So when I was conducting my research, I would ask people how they came to their current views. I asked everybody this. Those who believed that homosexuality was sinful cited a range of things. They would cite the Bible. They would cite their convictions. One member said, well, I know that I'm right because I feel very comfortable with my views, and God would not let me feel comfortable if I were wrong. I was like, okay, nice. That's great. Or their knowledge that homosexuality was disordered and that the creation story was about creating order out of chaos. In contrast, pro-gay church members repeatedly, constantly, answered the question, how did you come to your views, by talking about somebody in their life, their brother, their child, a friend, or sometimes even a speaker or a movie sometimes. I found this a bit troubling, since people like Mark can also know gay people, but that doesn't change anything for them. And for a long time, I had trouble figuring out what is it about knowing somebody that makes a difference that doesn't make a difference for other people. And this wasn't just in my research. There's a more recent study that just came out last spring of the Methodist General Conference, which is the equivalent of the General Assembly. A sociologist named Amanda Udis-Kessler observed pro-gay organizers at the General Conference chanting slogans like "See our people" and "Know your people." And they also set up a table during the course of the General Conference, which was 10, 11 days, to give delegates the opportunity to sit down and get to know a gay man or a lesbian. And these strategies didn't work. Interestingly enough, the assumption that knowing one was what made the difference, that knowing one was sufficient to change people's understandings of God and humanity's place in creation, that assumption didn't really hold true. And it led to an argument, that if you knew one, then you'd change your mind, that just seemed completely irrelevant to people who believed that homosexuality was sinful. I hear that there has actually been success at the General Assembly with personing the issue, with finding ways to hit home to sort of create some kind of relationship kind of experience. It'd be interesting to discuss that and see what exactly it is that makes this successful in this particular setting when it might not work in other settings. But a lot of times, these strategies don't work as well as we might hope. They don't do what we have in mind. Another thing that a lot of times happens is organizers will set up some kind of panel or a discussion where, one or a few gay men or lesbian and a transgender person or whatever will try to create something like an opportunity for dialogue, where someone will talk about themselves, tell their life story to an audience that may or may not be hostile. I'm open to the possibility that this could actually be effective at times for particular people, and I'd be interested to hear stories about that as well, but I actually see a couple shortcomings to this approach. One, a lot of times these speakers, especially in the church settings that I've observed, end up experiencing pain just by virtue of having to account for themselves and justify their existence in a room full of people who might be hostile about it. So then they perform pain. And then the reason that the church comes up with to welcome them, or the reason that the people who've been holdouts decide to welcome them, is because of the pain that they've been in. And the problem with that is that if the welcome is conditioned on being in pain, of course the church should welcome people who are in pain, but if the welcome of gay men and lesbians and transgender people and bisexuals is contingent on their being in pain, then it can become hard for people to understand why somebody would want to be in the church if they're not in pain. Right? Well, what are you doing here? What, you think you've got it all figured out? That there becomes this requirement to demonstrate pain that isn't required of straight people or isn't required of putative straight people. Similarly, a performance of gay pain doesn't necessarily convince people that homosexuality is not sinful. Right? If you're of the mindset that homosexuality is caused by family dysfunction the way alcoholism is, then of course those people are going to be in pain. And the pain isn't because of the discrimination. The pain isn't because they've been shut out of the community that they thought was supposed to, cherish them with unconditional love forever. It's because they suffer from dysfunction. Of course they're in pain. Pain doesn't necessarily mean that homosexuality is okay. It doesn't even necessarily mean that that it's not a choice, because you can still choose. An alcoholic can choose not to drink day to day to day, and similarly, somebody disposed toward same-sex sexual experience can choose not to do that from day to day to day. And the assumption is that they would be in less pain if they stopped doing that. And finally, sometimes, just to me, sometimes these events can feel sort of like an audition for humanity, and not just for oneself, but for everybody. I'm here, to just talk about myself, but really, you're going to decide whether gay people are fully human and are fully capable of doing God's work and understanding God's intentions as much as anybody else. You're going to determine that on the basis of whether I satisfy your requirements in this discussion, right? So it's like auditioning to be not just a member of the church, but to be an equal part of humanity with, a few Simon Cowells in the room being like, oh, this is terrible. That didn't convince me at all. And the difficulty with these strategies, I think, is that it's not knowing one that makes the difference. It's relating. And that's a kind of a different thing. The strategies that were not as helpful as they could have been, they didn't promote dialogue, which is Martin Buber's term for where relating happens. Let's see. Okay, so dialogue. Here's what Buber says about dialogue. For him, each one of us has two different kinds of I. Right? This is going to get a little but bear with me. Just soak it in. So there's the I in an I-it relationship, and a relationship to an object. And that can be the object of your affection, can be the object of asking for directions or getting medical help. But it's the I that is relating to an object. And he says the I of the I-it experience is the ego. who occupies himself with his my manner, my race, my works, my genius, my need for directions, my hope that my mom will do my laundry for me, my desire for my friend to be there and help me when I'm feeling sad. It's not like this kind of I-it relationship is a bad thing. Calling people it sounds, like you're dehumanizing them, but Buber doesn't really mean it that way. We need to have these kinds of relationships, otherwise nothing would ever get done. But there's also a different kind of I that comes about far more rarely than the I and the I-it relationship. And that is the I in the I-you or I-thou, the intimate you relationship, that I-you connection. And so he says the I of the I-you relationship is the person, open to infinite conversation, open to being touched at the core. And it's the kind of experience that's hard to nail down. We can't talk about it in objective terms, but most of us have had this kind of experience where, and it might not be just in a conversation with another person. It might be hearing a song that just touches you at the core, or seeing a movie, or reading a book, where someone is really speaking to you and you feel like you're communing with that person. Buber says, the you encounters me by grace. It cannot be found by seeking. Right? We can't just will an I-you intimate connection into existence, bing, like when we want it to happen. It cannot be found by seeking. He also says the relation to the you is unmediated. Nothing conceptual intervenes between I and you. No prior knowledge and no imagination. None of those stereotypes that we have of who we're talking to. The memory itself is changed as it plunges from particularity into wholeness. No purpose intervenes between you and I. No greed and no anticipation. Right? So a reconciliation meeting where we're going to sit down for an hour, we're going to have 4 of these so everyone can find a time to come and express their stupid fears and their ignorance, and then, we'll tell them what's wrong with that, and then we'll move on. That is not creating a relationship. That is not dialogue. Dialogue has no goal. It has no greed. It has no anticipation. That's going to come later. So it can be very difficult to find a time and find the space and to find the energy to relate to somebody that you disagree with in a question that's so profound and so important. And certainly you should not only do that, because that could be very draining and it could be very disappointing. You might find people who aren't actually willing to be in dialogue with you. And it's absolutely crucial to have a home, to have the people who restore you, to have the people who energize you for the next part of the struggle. Drawing from Buber, there's a practice called compassionate listening. That's its real name. The names that I've used have been pseudonyms, but this is a real name, compassionate listening, that emphasizes techniques for listening beyond statements that reflect a speaker's fear and defensiveness, or might trigger defensiveness in others, reflecting back or articulating to the speaker the good intentions behind their statements, the motivation behind their statement. Intentions that the speaker might not be able to articulate her or himself. So when Mark was talking about social order, rather than telling him how wrong he was or making points that seemed irrelevant to him, to reflect back to him the shared values behind his comments might mean recognizing his concern for pleasing God. It might, and to say that, I see that it's really important to you to please God, that's the important thing. And that might have been a way to open a conversation. And then you could say, tell me more about that. And then you could say, for me, it really seems like pleasing God comes from more of a New Testament view of what sin is and what love is, rather than this sort of following the law kind of obedience, or something like that. You might think of other ways that you could address this concern and move the conversation forward. It's hard to say exactly where it would go, but the point is to listen beyond what they're saying, rather than just sort of project, listen to this jerk. He thinks that they have a choice, when he said nothing of the kind. Likewise, at a dialogue retreat that I attended, I met a guy, another student named Sam, from Oregon, who told me in a casual lunch conversation about meetings that he had helped to organize where environmentalists and loggers were brought together to develop land use policies. And he remarked they came in with all kinds of preconceptions about each other, and sometimes it takes 3 meetings just to be able to have a civil conversation without people screaming at each other. And I chuckled and asked why anybody would go back a second time, and he pointed out that they had to, if they wanted a say in the land use policy, they had to keep coming back. But eventually, he continued, they could realize that they all had things in common, that their projections onto each other weren't accurate or fair. Loggers didn't hate trees and animals and want to destroy it all as fast as possible, and environmentalists weren't more concerned about owls than people. Buber's concept of relating helps to shed light on a lot of what I've seen in these struggles. It's not just knowing one, but relating to somebody. My friend, my brother, somebody I saw in this movie, whatever it is. I mean, a lot of people can see a lot of movies, but sometimes a movie touches you at a core, and it's the relating that happened there, rather than the, having the popcorn and, dropping the $9.50. So relating to someone who's transgender, lesbian, bisexual, or gay makes the stigmatization of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people seem preposterous, dangerous, profoundly unfair, right? Not just like, oh yeah, I know it's hard for them, but like, this is not plausible. How can you think this is okay? It's the relating that makes that worldview transform. When people I've spoken with, including members of the conservative congregation that I studied, related to LGBT people, it became implausible to them that God could find gay intimacy more sinful than heterosexual intimacy, or find gay people less capable than heterosexuals of doing God's work. So this distinction between relating and knowing one can help us to explain why pro-gay strategies have often failed, like in the case that Udis Kessler observed and in the case that I observed. Because the strategies are premised on knowing one, and relating can't be willed into existence, certainly not among the unwilling. So how do we get to the church that we can see from here? Things to do. I want to elaborate the question a bit. To introduce the concept of dialogue, Buber tells a story about a meeting that he attended in 1914 where someone raised an objection to too many Jews being nominated to help form an international organization. Buber, as you may or may not know, was a Jewish theologian and sociologist. Sensing anti-Semitism on the part of the objector, Buber raised his own objection. And then he writes, I no longer knew how from that I came to speak of Jesus and to say that we Jews knew him from within, in the impulses and stirrings of his Jewish being, in a way that remains inaccessible to people submissive to him, in a way that remains inaccessible to you, so I directly addressed the former pastor. He stood up, I stood too, we looked into the heart of one another's eyes. It is gone, he said, and before everyone, we gave each other the kiss of brotherhood. In this transformation, dialogue was fulfilled. Opinions were gone. In a bodily way, the factual took place. In Buber's account, speaking from his heart to someone open to him, transformed the man, transformed his objection, and transformed their relationship. But what if the Christian man had not been open to Buber's words? What if he felt a personal stake in maintaining his authority as a Christian to decide just how many Jews should be permitted into their group? Similarly, the question for members of this group and related organizations might be, what do we do when others feel a personal stake in maintaining their authority as putative heterosexuals to determine whether or which non-heterosexuals should be permitted into their group? The struggle for this movement is that the playing field isn't even, and that LGBT people have to take more risks. That's the struggle for social justice. Things aren't equal. But if you can walk a fine line, dialogue can give participants the opportunity to humanize each other, to see each other as members of the same moral community. You're like me. We're all actually struggling for some of the same things. We're doing it in kind of different ways. For Buber, relating has to emerge organically, often through what he calls shared work. So what would that mean? Shared work would mean finding opportunities to build relationships. That, in addition to doing this work, or if this work wears you out for a while, doing other things, organizing, a service project, or being on the committee to oversee the, church building renovations, or, singing in the choir. And things like that can be opportunities to build relationship in a non-polarized setting. Let's see, what else? Dialogue in good faith, right? Listen to what people are saying and share your own without the sense that you're just sort of spitting propaganda. Share your story of how you came to be where you are, right? And listen and invite them to share their story of how they came to be where they are. Sharing stories is a way to overcome this polarization, and not to interrupt the story, not to hear the story out and be like, okay, now I understand where you're coming from a little better, can be really helpful. And I know it can also be really exhausting and tiring, because sometimes you don't really care about, excuse me, how this person got to their stupid place. But if you can find a way to make it interesting, right? If you can find a way to care, it can actually help. For me, seriously just wanting to know what was going on in these debates, seriously wanting to understand, to set my own views aside, which is a methodological requirement of a researcher, but is also a helpful thing to be able to do in real life when you're not the researcher, right? To just be able to say, no, I don't want to put my views out there. I want to know where this is coming from, and to really care can make a difference. Hearing what people are saying and responding to that and to the good intentions behind it, and possibly seeking training in dialogue to acquire the skills to be able to have those conversations really effectively. I've seen people who are masters at this in ways that I would never even think to say the things that they're saying that are so brilliant, but they learned them in a workshop. They learn these techniques. And so seeking dialogue training can be a really helpful thing. But you need to find balance. The challenge for the future, I think, is going to be to create dialogue opportunities that allow for real relating, not manipulative attempts to wear others down, not auditions for membership in the church or humanity, but the real kinds of non-goal-oriented relating that I'm sure many of you have experienced at some point or another. But at the same time, there's nothing to be gained by dropping the political aspects of the struggle, by dropping the goals. There's a real struggle for authority happening when it comes to matters of human sexuality, and LGBT people can't afford to drop this struggle. And I would imagine that many of you feel that the church can't afford for you to drop this struggle. The most effective and exciting political movements that I've seen combine aspects of dialogue with a struggle to move forward, never content to just create good feelings and friendship, but always finding ways to move beyond, that somehow move beyond cynicism, are not cynical, are, as Eddie was saying yesterday, that stand on Scripture, that insist that this is God's work, and that movement forward has to happen. The challenge for this movement is going to be to find a creative synthesis, I think, between these two dynamics, but they're very different. But I think you can do it, and I think you are doing it, and I think it's exciting. And to think back to the world that I grew up in X number of years ago, and the world that we live in now, that this movement has such momentum and is moving so forward is a really hopeful thing, and I think you should, be, firm in that hope. I think there is a lot of hope, and there's a lot of good change happening. So thank you very much for your time and patience. I appreciate it.